While Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were able to invade and occupy European powers, including France, many are unaware of the resistance the Yugoslav Partisans, a group of rebels from across Yugoslavia, put up against the Axis. When Germany invaded Yugoslavia in 1941, it was a nation barely 2 decades old and still experienced ethnic tensions. In addition, Yugoslavia only had a population of around 15 million throughout the Second World War. This was less than a quarter of Germany's population and significantly less than the 40 million people that made up France, which was invaded by Hitler's forces in just 6 weeks. If these factors were not enough, Yugoslavia was surrounded by Hitler's allies, with Italy bordering Slovenia to the east and Hungary to the north. How can a military group from such a young and vulnerable nation that Yugoslavia was in 1941 fend off a sustained Nazi occupation unlike many European powers? In order to answer this compelling question, it is important to understand Yugoslavia's history. After the Austria-Hungary Habsburg Empire ended at the end of the First World War, the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was formed on December 1st, 1918. This unification of the Slavic peoples was the culmination of the Illyrian movement, which was based on the myth that all Yugoslavs, or Southern Slavs, descended from ancient Illyrian people and as a result should be unified by one state. However, this idyllic notion that all Yugoslavs can live together in harmony proved to be misguided. As the kingdom was ruled by King Peter I, a Serbian monarch, Croats objected to the terms of the constitution. In the early 1920s, Serbian politician Nikola Pasic attempted to rig elections against the Croatian Peasant Party by confiscating opposition pamphlets and using the police to influence the vote. In August 1928, tensions between Serbs and Croats manifested into violence when Croatian politician Stepan Radic was assassinated. After invading the Netherlands, Belgium, and France during the summer of 1940, Hitler launched a campaign on Yugoslavia during the spring of 1941. Taking control over Yugoslavia was strategically important, as it would give Germany access to the Adriatic Sea, which flowed into the Mediterranean, and physically connect it with Italy, its strongest ally. On April 6th, Hitler launched Operation 25, an elaborate scheme to occupy Yugoslavia by using the Luftwaffe to bomb Belgrade, Italian forces to take over the city of Ljubljana in modern-day Slovenia, and additional support from Hungarian and Bulgarian forces. The Axis's coordination overwhelmed any resistance, resulting in Yugoslavia falling in less than 2 weeks. Italy occupied modern-day Slovenia and much of Yugoslavia's Adriatic coast. The Nazi-allied fascist Ustasha movement established the first independent state of Croatia on April 10th. The invasion ended on April 18th, when an armistice was signed, resulting in the Serb Banat region falling into Axis occupation. Serbia's occupation proved to be critical in how the Yugoslav war effort played out. While there was a large-scale uprising across Serbia against Nazi occupation throughout the later half of 1941, the Nazis suppressed the movement with large-scale executions. As a result of the Nazis exerting its might on the Serbian people, a group of Serbian nationals known as the Chetniks strategically collaborated with the Nazis despite its anti-Axis position. Even though the Chetniks participated in the 1941 uprisings against the Nazis, Chetnik leader Draza Mihailović realized that fighting the Nazis was no longer worth it in terms of saving Serbian lives. While the Chetniks decided to cooperate with the Nazis in the wake of indiscriminate killings of women and children, many, particularly in modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina, felt the need to stand up to this unjust treatment. With the royal family relocated in London and the Yugoslav government based out of Cairo, there was no one to maintain law and order. Recognizing the disorder Nazi loyalist militias were engaged in throughout the summer of 1941, the Communist Party of Yugoslavia moved to organize anti-fascist militias. The rebels in this collection of anti-Axis militias were collectively known as Partisans, led by established socialist revolutionary Josip Broz Tito. The catalyst for the partisan movement was Hitler's assault on the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Recognizing the attack on the Soviet Union as a significant assault on communism, significant guerrilla attacks on Axis forces began. Tito recognized that frontal combat against the Nazis was ineffective, as Hitler's forces were a more established army with sophisticated artillery. As a result, Tito desired a less centralized military effort that acted spontaneously. The guerrilla-style combat was something the Nazis had not faced on a large scale up to that point, as all the Chetniks conceded to the Nazis relatively quickly. Partisan support saw significant growth in September 1941 when Serb Chetniks assisted Italian forces in exterminating Croats and Muslims living in parts of Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. This takeover by Italians with the help of Chetniks helped the partisans in the long run, as the Croats and Muslims who fled their villages joined and took arms for the partisans. While many of the early partisans were Serbs or Slovenes, partisan leaders recognized they were founded on ideology rather than ethnicity, meaning they had to capture a more diverse following. Partisans such as Svetozar Vukmanović even initiated propaganda that challenged inter-ethnic hatred. He wrote in his memoir in July 1941, quote, "If we wish the Muslim and Croatian population to go over on our side, the partisan units will have to avoid attacks on Muslim and Croat villages." The openness to ethnic diversity allowed the partisan movement to garner support across Yugoslavia, even in isolated villages that were more ethnically homogeneous. In order to reach people across Yugoslavia, forms of media such as newspapers and the radio were used to antagonize Chetniks and retain new members. In November 1941, a Bosnian partisan unit sent out leaflets emphasizing that they were not like Serbian Chetniks who committed atrocities against innocent Croatians. In addition, partisan leadership used Radio Free Yugoslavia, a national radio station, to criticize the royal family living in London and the Yugoslav government in Cairo. The use of the radio to garner support was especially important because a growing number of people had radios, as people living across the world saw them as a necessity to keep up with the fighting. The partisans not only had success with the media influencing those living in Yugoslavia, their messages influenced leaders outside of Yugoslavia. While initially British intelligence recognized the Chetniks as the official resistance in Yugoslavia and even sent specialized operations executive agents to assist them, Britain's support for them diminished as they realized the Chetniks were collaborating with the Nazis. Britain's reversal on their support for the partisans can be attributed to the partisans' accusation that Chetnik leader Draza Mihailović was collaborating with the Axis, being echoed throughout American, British, and Soviet press. As a result, Britain backed the partisans in their civil war against the Chetniks. After the Yugoslav government in forced exile appointed Chetnik leader Draza Mihailović as Minister of War on January 13, 1942, many partisans and others wary of the royal family were even more distrustful as a result of his connection with the émigré government. Because the leader of the Chetniks was no longer just a leader of a movement, rather the Minister of War for the entirety of Yugoslavia, the partisans monitored and documented his policies to a greater extent. On May 1, 1942, there was a story in the Stockholm Tidningen, a prominent Swedish newspaper at the time, that, quote, "a report of a force under Colonel Danjic, a Serb, which avoided attacking German and Bulgarian troops and devoted its energies to avenging Serbs in Croatia." The information published in the Swedish newspaper reflects the partisans' success in gathering intelligence and disseminating information against the Chetniks hundreds of miles away. Rather than systematically referring to the Chetniks as a whole, the paper focuses on a specific group led by a particular general. Stating information that is more specific can resonate with individuals living far away from the conflict. In addition, information about the Chetniks' actions not only reached leaders of world powers such as the US and Britain, rather everyday people in a place like Stockholm were informed. The partisans were not only successful in terms of growing their movement, they found ways to test Germany's military despite having a less established military. Franklin A. Lindsay, an American spy assigned by the OSS to parachute behind German lines, describes the partisans' guerrilla warfare tactics in his book Beacons in the Night. Lindsay describes tank traps the partisans built that were strong enough for the partisans to walk across but would collapse when a tank drove over. Lindsay writes, quote, "The purposes of these defenses were not to stop the Germans, but to oblige them to commit large forces in their attacks on partisan territory. The need to use large forces limited the amount of offenses the Germans could mount, and gave the partisans, with extensive intelligence network in the towns and valleys, ample warning of such attacks as well." End quote. Even though partisan troops did not have proper uniforms, they were able to force the Germans to be deliberate with the attacks and not let them run the partisans over. The partisans did not only test the military strategy of the Germans. Slovene partisans tested the Italian army when they attacked parts of Italy such as Gorizia and Istria, forcing it to call in German troops. While the partisans were unable to effectively counter the initial Italian assault at the end of 1942, they were able to make it difficult for them. It was not until June 1943 when Axis forces surrounded Mihailovich and Tito's forces. In fact, they were able to escape from Dermitor Planina in northern Montenegro after German, Italian, Bulgarian, and Croat troops surrounded them. Even though the partisans lost the territory in northern Montenegro, their ability to drag out the Axis invasion gave them time to organize. While the partisans were composed of many individual militias, it was well organized, allowing different groups to coordinate with each other and have support. The organization came from a hierarchical structure that connected top military officials with partisan detachments. Partisan detachments were able to be easily formed, must have been open to membership, and must have been linked with regional headquarters. Regional headquarters were responsible for providing food, maintaining order amongst troops, and identifying and suppressing spies within the ranks. In addition, headquarters were expected to communicate intelligence with each other about attacks and battle coordination. Above the regional headquarters were head offices located in Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Vojvodina, Dalmatia, Macedonia, and Zanzak. The head offices were responsible for taking care of the wounded. At the top of the partisan hierarchy was the general headquarters of the People's Liberation Partisan Detachments of Yugoslavia. According to the Bulletin of International News, quote, "The ability of the communist leaders of the partisans to give coherence to this resistance in Dalmatia, Bosnia, and South Croatia, and command of Soviet support account for the rapid growth of partisan power in 1942 through 1943, end quote. With the growth of the partisan movement, it was not only organized militarily, it was also administratively. Partisans made sure that there was political and administrative organization in the places they liberated. For example, after the area where the Kozara Mountains in Bosnia was reclaimed from the Axis, it had its own newspaper, munitions, a repair shop, and medical staff. Having such services not only revitalized communities, it made them more resilient if they were to be attacked again. On November 30th, 1943, the Partisan Anti-Fascist Council met in the city of Yase to ratify a constitution which created a Supreme Council. The council consisted of one president, 5 vice presidents, 2 secretaries, and at least 40 other members. The Constitution made sure to reflect the ethnic diversity the partisan movement attracted in the Supreme Council. The council was composed of 23 Serbs, 20 Croats, 10 Slovenes, 4 Montenegrins, 4 Macedonians, and 3 Muslims. Having a system of government not only organized the partisans as a military force, it also allowed them to have political influence. In his book, Lindsay recalls, quote, each commander in the partisan military hierarchy was paralleled by a political commissar, down to the lowest level of a platoon of 15 to 40 men. Officially, the military commander was responsible for all combat functions. The commissar was responsible for education, political indoctrination, supply, and political organization of the several areas under partisan control, as well as for secret organization in adjoining areas under German control. End quote. According to Lindsay's accounts, the political commissar ensured that not only people within partisan territory sympathized with them, those in Axis-occupied territory can still be connected to the partisan movement. Political organization in Axis-controlled territory could have countered Nazi indoctrination and foster internal resistance. Political organization in partisan-occupied areas allowed for any open anti-partisan sentiment to be suppressed. The political growth of the partisan movement led to the establishment of the Democratic Federal of Yugoslavia, a provincial state, on November 29, 1943. The provincial body of this government, led by Tito, was the National Committee for the Liberation of Yugoslavia. An important consequence of this provincial state was that the partisan efforts were no longer a movement. They represented actions by government on the international stage. Democratic Federal of Yugoslavia was immediately recognized by Allied superpowers, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union at the Tehran Conference. Having a government recognized by the Allied powers allowed for Tito and the partisans to get support from the Allies militarily. A former classified U.S. Air Force intelligence memo from August 8, 1947 explains why Britain and the United States decided to back the partisans and not the Chetniks in 1943. The memo states, quote, when proof of Chetnik collaboration reached the Allies, full support went to the partisans. With the aid of Allied forces, Tito soon built up a formidable force. By February 1944, his National Army of Liberation had 10 Army Corps with a strength estimated at more than 22,000 men. End quote. The quote reveals as soon as the Allies began providing significant military support during the beginning of 1944, Tito's army became significantly stronger. In addition, the intelligence memo recognizes the organization of Tito's forces by mentioning it had 10 army corps. As soon as the Allied powers backed the partisans and removed any aid from the Chetniks, the partisans engaged in civil war with the Chetniks. Eventually, with the support of Soviet forces, well-armed partisans defeated Mihailovich's Royal Yugoslav Army in Serbia. On October 20th, 1944, Belgrade was liberated. The Axis' last stand in Yugoslavia came when the partisans defeated the armed forces in Wehrmacht on May 15, 1945. Ultimately, the partisans were able to sustain their movement for over 3 years until they were in a position to defeat the Axis. Their success can be attributed to a number of factors, including an openness to ethnic diversity within their movement, effective use of media, and an organized military and political system. Allowing other ethnicities, such as Croats and Muslims, to enlist as partisans expanded their manpower and built sympathy amongst those communities. This allowed for resistance in places like occupied Croatia. The effective use of media, such as the radio and newspapers, allowed for partisans to communicate the threat Chetniks posed throughout Yugoslavia. As a result, partisans were able to reach Yugoslavs living even in the most remote areas. In addition, the media was used to let the Allied nations know the Chetniks were collaborating with the Nazis and that the partisans needed their support. An organized military hierarchy allowed for partisan detachments to receive intelligence about threats, suppress any disorder within the ranks, and be organized in combat. The establishment of the Supreme Council and eventually a provincial state allowed partisans to ultimately be recognized on an international stage and receive significant Allied military support. All of these factors came together to create a resilient movement that was ultimately able to endure the test of time of Axis occupation. After the Axis rolled over Yugoslavia in 12 days during April 1941, it was the partisans' mission to make it as difficult as possible for them. They implemented tactics such as building tank traps, pursuing guerrilla ambushes, and tested the Axis military strategy by invading parts of Italy. Time gave the partisans an opportunity to not only develop an army, but to develop communities from small villages to large cities. Eventually, leaders were appointed and a government was established. By the end of their occupation of Yugoslavia, the Axis was fighting against an internationally recognized state.